The Future of Conservation, or Preserving Orchids in the Wild. How many of us are involved in orchid conservation? Well, I asked this question to get you to think a little bit. What are we doing really every day for orchid conservation? How many of you would be involved but don't have the time, interest, or budget? Well, these are the kind of questions you maybe think of. I don't have time or the interest or the budget to be involved in conservation, but in actuality, you really do. You have time to do some of the things that I'll talk about in this presentation. Certainly you have the interest since you raise orchids, and the budget, well, you'll find that you'll probably save on your budget doing some of the things that will help conservation. My interest in conservation began in the 1980s when I was fortunate enough to be assigned to a startup of a manufacturing plant with Texas Instruments in northern Luzon, high in the mountains in the Philippines. I learned about orchids on this 5-year assignment, went all over Luzon and many other parts of the Philippines looking for orchids, got very interested in Philippine species, but also learned that there was important work going on in other countries. This person, Michael Wee, in Malaysia, was going in ahead of the saws and axes, cutting down forest in Malaysia, and he was collecting beautiful samples of this Violacea, Phalaenopsis violacea, Phalaenopsis gigantea, and many others species that were found in the jungles there in Malaysia. I was very fortunate on one of my breaks from work in the Philippines to go to Malaysia and visit him and get to see his collection and some of the areas that he had special access to in preserving the Malaysian orchid species. This is an example of the Phalaenopsis violacea. It's a beautiful, beautiful orchid found in Malaysia and one that's been the subject of a couple of my watercolors. Later on, I purchased a book on conservation, and this picture really struck me, particularly with my interest in the orchids of the Philippines. This shows a warehouse full of species of Schilleriana collected from the wild in the early 1900s, and it shows just how we treated orchids very early on and so many other important resources of various countries that we had access to. Later in my career of interest in orchids, I was introduced to the Orchid Conservation Alliance, got very interested in the work that they do. Mainly, they go in and work with local organizations that are already preserving orchids, help them expand and help them protect their special, highly diverse areas that are known for many, many orchid species. Here's an example of one in Brazil. This is Serra Bonita. It's in the Atlantic rainforest right on the coast in Brazil. It has many, many different species of orchids and other species. And the other species are what a lot of organizations are interested in. People that are interested in birds or frogs, whatever their interest may be, they are interested in this area. We as orchid growers are interested, and the organizations such as the Orchid Conservation Alliance and the Rainforest Trust work to preserve these areas, the total setup of all the different species, and together it protects this preserve. Here are some pictures taken by Gary Yonggi. He went on a trip with the Orchid Conservation Alliance in 2014, and he shared with me some of the photographs that he took. Beautiful, beautiful species of Cattleya in the wild. Many, many other species that we may not be so familiar with on a day-to-day basis are also found. You're all aware that there are thousands and thousands of orchid species. Many of them don't have so much of a commercial interest that we would see them at grocery stores, but these are of interest to people who are very much interested in orchid species and preserving the vast diversity that nature has provided us. The Dracula Orchid Preserve in Ecuador is one that was a joint effort by the Orchid Conservation Alliance and the Rainforest Trust to preserve 600 acres that have been known to have many different Dracula species. I particularly thought this was an interesting picture, the Dracula vampira. Dracula means little dragon. It's really not the creature of mythology, but it does make a very interesting genus and species when you put together Dracula and vampira. But seriously, this is a very important project that's preserving some species of Dracula that are only found in this one area in Ecuador. So this is where we are today. We're raising funds to buy land, to set up preserves. We're competing with agricultural interests, cattle ranching, logging, everything that has a claim to the land that orchids are found in. Forests are being destroyed at the rate of about 5 football fields a minute. It's just an ongoing erosion of the special lands that we have preserved of the rainforest. So what is the future of conservation? There are 3 factors that I've identified that I think define how we look at conservation, particularly now and in the future. The first is climate change, next is health and agriculture, and social action. These are the 3 categories that will be defining our future actions in conservation. For climate change, we're also familiar with global warming, but there's a lot more to just the concept of our summers getting warmer or our winters getting warmer or ice melting at the polar caps. It's really given us the ability to think more about nature as a whole and what we are doing. It's reawakening our understanding of nature. It's changing the way we think about our planet, and the emphasis is on the total ecosystem. We're starting to understand how all of nature works together, and this helps us understand the impact we have with our daily life, our daily activities. Conserving orchids is, of course, part of this overall picture because the habitats which orchids survive in or are found in now are very important to the future. We must preserve everything we can about these habitats, all the different species that live there. They all work together in a total ecosystem, and this is what needs to be understood and is starting to be better understood by the general public. Here's an example of a project that's taken place in Sumatra in Indonesia. The Rainforest Trust has been working to expand by 200,000 acres an already existing area called 30 Hills Reserve. This is a very critical area for protecting orangutans, elephants, and tigers, which are highly endangered on this island of Sumatra. Of course, Indonesia, we know, also includes Borneo. There are many species on both of these islands that are endangered. Here's an example. The pygmy elephant, only about 20 to 80 remain. The Sumatran tiger, we've all heard about, only about 400 remain. 3 years is all that the biologists say that the life of this animal in the wild can survive with the high rate of deforestation that's taking place in Borneo and Sumatra. The Bornean orangutan is about 50% of the species, or this species, have been lost as we've gone in and destroyed its habitat, as well as the Sumatran rhino. Only about 100 remain. It's shown here that there are 15,000 flowering plant species just on these two islands, 221 species of mammals, and 420 species of birds. They all need to be protected, as well as orchids are included in the flowering plant species. So as we help preserve the life of these major animals, we're also preserving the total habitat on these two islands. Climate change, carbon emissions are becoming a part of everyday conversation. We measure just about everything we do as far as CO2 impact. This has given us a new language in which we can look at the total picture of what we're doing to our natural resources. One way of looking at what's going on is the impact we're having on people ourselves. We're recognizing that we have a health hazard. Here's showing the major air pollution in June 2013, showing the smoke going over into Malaysia and Singapore, drifting over from all the burning fires that are very hard to put out in the peat bogs that exist in this part of Sumatra. Sumatra has about 5% of the world's area of peat bog, and this area has not been used that much for agriculture in the past. There have been other areas that have been deforested that were easier to get to, but now with these areas, it's a prime area for raising palm oil. We'll talk about a little more in a minute. But these peat bogs are being drained and burned and creating a major smoke hazard in major areas such as Singapore and Malaysia. This is a picture of some of the canals dug along these peat bogs. You can see the water level is very high. It needs to be drained down a few more feet in order for the palm oil to be raised on this land. But when they drain it, these peat bogs will start to decompose, and this releases methane, which we know is 25 times more damaging to our atmosphere than CO2. So this has a double impact. Not only do we burn these forests after we drain them, but we've also subjected our atmosphere to additional CO2, methane damage, as well as the CO2. The deforestation is estimated to be between 10 and 30% of the total global greenhouse gases, and this is greater than the emissions we see from all our vehicles, our transportation. About 300 football fields, that seems to be the standard measure of deforestation. 300 football fields is cleared each hour to make way for palm oil production. For us here in Dallas, we know the size of the North Park Shopping Center. 300 football fields is about 3 times the size of our North Park shopping center. In a single generation, about 50% of Borneo forest has been lost to logging or agriculture, palm oil being one of the culprits. This was a headline in the Washington Post in October 2015, and it's titled, "Why the Biggest Climate Story on the Planet is Happening in Indonesia Right Now." They recognize, and the article recognized, just the major devastation that's just going on unabated in Indonesia right now. But as we saw in the earlier slides, it's been going on since 2013. But currently the emissions are so great that it surpasses the daily emissions in CO2 equivalent to the entire output of the U.S. economy. So all the CO2 that we release at one time in the U.S. is surpassed on a daily basis by what's lost from the deforestation in Indonesia. And of course, we saw the toxic haze, which is a major health issue in Malaysia and Singapore. Health and agriculture is another area that will be a major area to be examined for the future of conservation. We're taking a new and smarter look at health and agriculture. We see that from some of the guidelines being produced by our government organizations here and around the world. But we've known for some time that an animal-based diet versus a plant-based diet has a tremendous impact on global warming. The livestock industry contributes about 10% of all the human-induced CO2. But the methane is 37% of the being produced. 37% comes from the emissions from the cattle. 65% of the nitrous oxide is also produced in the livestock section. And I'm sure this includes not only the beef, but chickens and pigs, other livestock. Deforestation in all these livestock operations takes up about 30% of the agricultural land on the earth. You add to it all the grain, and that's about another 30%, so about 60% of our agricultural land goes to supporting animals, then which we in turn eat. Another item to look at is the waste from all these animals, and these animals produce about 130 times as much waste as the entire human population does. The human population waste is controlled and processed to minimize the impact to the environment. But we have all of this uncontrolled waste from the animals, which goes into our rivers and streams and has a further major impact on our environment. Cattle ranching itself causes about 65 to 70% of the deforestation in Brazil. Brazil is a major beef exporter. About 200 million head of cattle are raised there, and this consumes a major part of land which has to be cleared or deforestation just to raise this cattle. This picture says it all. Our what we consume on a daily basis does impact deforestation. Here, their selection of meat products all contributes to the deforestation. This picture gives you an idea of the health aspect. This from the Dallas Morning News editorial page in 2015. Veggies are much more healthy to eat than the meat products, but our guidelines pretty much soft pedal some of the impact and the major influence by the beef and cattle industry really won't let us go in and make the guidelines quite as stringent as they really should be. Here's an example from John Robbins' book in 1992 that shows the health-related issues for eating animal products. Colon cancer, you can see the left-hand column representing a city in the U.S. Each one of these represents a different city around the world. You can see the leading issues of colon cancer related to meat consumption. We're a leader in the U.S. as well as heart disease, and you can see at the bottom graph the per capita meat consumption. That left-hand bar represents the amount or the relative proportion of the amount of meat that's consumed per 100,000 population in the U.S. The last, social action. This is an area that can have a major impact on conservation. Here's one effort that really shows how activism can help change policies. 400,000 signatures helped change the airline policy of shipping hunting trophies back to the U.S. or from whatever country a person came from when they went to these areas to hunt. And of course, we all recognize Cecil the lion, which caused such an uproar that several of our major airlines have changed their policy on shipping trophies. Another area would be measuring the responsibility of major corporations in how they process palm oil. The sustainability, they call it, is recognizing that they are not getting palm oil from newly cleared rainforest areas, but are getting it from repurposed, agriculturally used sites around the world, with the idea that they can get all their palm oil without destroying the rainforest. Unfortunately, this roundtable on sustainable palm oil is really an organization of palm oil producers out to get agreements that make themselves look good, but in reality, they can't control the pipeline of the oil, the raw materials coming into their factories, because they don't have full accountability of who all's producing the palm oil or bringing in the palm oil products for their factories to produce the palm oil. Palm oil is found in just about everything that we consume. It's very, very hard to find products that don't contain palm oil, but they're there, and if you look carefully on labels and learn all the different names that palm oil comes under, then you can see who's using the most palm oil. These charts show two of the four charts that I'll be showing you. The left one is packaged food, and the right one is personal care. You can see a lot of products that we're familiar with, and they all use palm oil in many of their products. And the score ratings show how well they've agreed, or how much of their products they've agreed to make rainforest-friendly palm oil production for. But in reality, they are still forecasting about a 60% increase in palm oil production over the next 5 years. So that's not very sustainable to say that they're only using existing land, and yet they're going to find enough land for 60% more without damaging further our rainforest. It's just not a good way. It's not a good enough way to protect our rainforest. We need to reduce the demand. Here are two more tables. One is the fast food on the left. Many of these labels we recognize. The store brands on the right are the different markets where we purchase these products. And again, the scores show their color code about how strong their commitments are. But again, they don't have full control, and we're still having deforestation, even though there's been some initial effort toward getting these commitments. So how many of us are involved in orchid conservation? I believe we're all impacting it, certainly. Many of us think we aren't involved, don't have the time, interest, or budget, but we'll see that we do have time to read labels. We certainly have the interest, being orchid growers, And again, the impact that we have on our budget will be quite an improvement. You can read labels to avoid products with palm oil. Itself, it's not a very healthy product. You can go to change.org, select on environment, and you can cast a vote, and you can be part of efforts to impact different environmental processes that are going on. And you're voting, and the pressure of the public does work. Stay informed. It takes a lot of time, but if you go to my website, I'm trying to keep abreast of a lot of the things going on and articles of interest that I publish in there to help you have a source to find out what things are impacting orchid conservation and the areas where orchids are found. The future of conservation, well, it's in your hands. We can't rely on other organizations to do it. We need to take action ourselves. We need to put on the pressure to corporations to eliminate palm oil. We need to change our diets to reduce the amount of meat we have on it. The choice are ours, and it's up to us to make the difference. Thank you.